All right, now that the witness has been sworn, let me just inquire, have you viewed any of the testimony that has taken place in this trial since it started?
Uh, no, Your Honor.
Have you talked to anyone else about any testimony they've given in trial?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thanks for your responses. You can inquire, Mr. Wixom.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, will you please state and spell your full name for the record?
My name is Douglas Halepaska. That's Douglas Halepaska, Halepaska.
And where do you currently work?
I currently work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation Laboratory Division. I work in the capacity as a forensic examiner within the Firearms and Tool Marks Unit.
How long have you worked in that capacity?
Been working there since 2009.
What is your educational background?
I have a Bachelor's of Science, which I received from Texas A&M University in 2001. I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in Science and Technology and Intelligence.
In terms of your Bachelor's of Science degree, what is that area that you've got the bachelor's in?
I got that in environmental science with an emphasis in biochemistry and genetics.
What kind of work did you do before you went to work for the FBI?
Prior to working for the FBI, I spent 6 years in the United States Marine Corps as an infantryman. After that, I worked at the biochemistry, biophysics department, Texas A&M University. After that, I worked for the Drug Enforcement Administration as a forensic chemist. Then with the Army as a field chemist for the Army's Test and Evaluation Command at Dugway Proving Ground. Evaluation Command at Dugway Proving Ground. Yes, ma'am. Dugway. Thank you.
As a firearms and tool mark examiner, can you explain to the jury what are the types of cases that you become involved with?
So often firearms and tool marks is thought of as two separate disciplines, but they're actually the same discipline. Within the discipline, you can think of a tool as nothing more that when two objects come into forceful contact, the harder of the two is going to mark the softer. So a firearm is really nothing more than a collection of different tool surfaces that is designed to control the expansion of the smokeless powder when the bullet is traveling down the barrel. The majority of the cases I work concerned firearms, tool marks. However, over the years, I have worked a number of tool mark cases.
When you say a number of tool mark cases, what do you mean by that as opposed to firearms?
Well, as I said, firearms identification is the same thing as tool mark identification, but where I'm working a case where no firearms are involved, it's just straight hand tools.
And when a case is referred to you, do you receive cases from outside agencies outside of the FBI?
Yes, I do.
When a case is referred to the FBI and it eventually reaches you, can you explain to the jury what is the intake process from the FBI before it gets to you?
The evidence often arrives via FedEx. Sometimes it's hand delivered by a law enforcement official. The evidence arrives at the laboratory at the Evidence Management Unit, EMU. And from there, that evidence is processed into the laboratory. The EMU unit, basically what they do is they just inventory the evidence. They assure that the contents of it in the container are there. They enter that information into the laboratory's evidence management system known as Forensic Advantage. And then from there, they generate an evidence sampling plan where the evidence is basically run through the different disciplines within the laboratory.
At some point, do you recall having a case referred to you from the Ada County Coroner's Office in Idaho in regard to remains for a Tylee Ryan?
Yes, I do.
And in fact, internally, was that case referred to you for tool mark analysis?
Yeah, that is correct.
Did you perform a tool mark analysis?
I did.
Before we talk about that, are there any specific terms that you might want to take a moment and explain to the jury before we begin to talk about that work?
I would. There are a number of terms that I'm going to use over. They're specific to my discipline. The first being as I told you, a tool and a tool mark are basically when two objects come into forceful contact. The harder of the two is going to mark the softer object. The softer object is going to receive the tool mark. There are two types of tool marks, impressed and strided. An impressed mark you could think of as if I were to take a hammer and slam it on this surface, there would be an impression of the working surface of that hammer head. That force would be applied perpendicular to the surface. The next tool mark is a strided tool mark. That occurs when force and motion is applied parallel or nearly parallel to the surface. And essentially, it look like a number of scratch marks. The next thing I want to discuss is characteristics. There are two types, class characteristics. Now, these are the general or measurable features of a specimen which indicate a restricted group source. These are design factors and are predetermined prior to the manufacturer. So what I'm talking about are tools. So when the tool is being manufactured, it's going to go under design factors. And the marks that it's going to make are going to be either general or measurable. An easy way to imagine it is if I had two types of screwdrivers, a Phillips and a flathead, and I were to strike that flathead screwdriver onto a surface, I'm going to have a general feature of a rectangle. Now, when I'm talking about the working surface, I'm only talking about that portion of the screwdriver, which is going to be used to do the work, the torquing. When that's applied to the surface, it's going to generate that rectangular shape, that general shape. But there's also other class characteristics. There are measurable features. So I would also be able to measure the length and width of that impressed mark on that surface. And there are also manufacturing factors or characteristics that would be transferred into that tool mark, such as was the screwdriver tip made using a milling, a broaching, that kind of thing. If I were to take that Phillips, strike into the, make an impression with that, it's going to generate a plus mark. So with these class characteristics, I'm able to actually differentiate different source populations. So if I had an impression made with a Phillips, it's going to make the plus sign, the flathead, the minus. So I'll be able to differentiate the different class characteristics and the different source populations. The next characteristic is the individual characteristics. These are the rapid and random imperfections that occur during the manufacturing process of the tool itself. They are totally incidental. Manufacturers do not intend for those to be implanted onto the tool surface. And it is these individual characteristics which are used to source or attribute a tool mark back to a particular tool.
Thank you. Your Honor, at this time, the state has pre-marked the state's proposed Exhibit 180A through 180L. I have a proposed for the court, a courtesy copy for the court, and one for the defense. They are offered per stipulation. We'll be moving for admission of those. Those exhibits are pictures of the remains of Kylie Ryan, very similar to the ones we've seen in the last case, or last witness, I'm sorry.
All right, on the exhibits, is there any objection to the admission of 180A through 180L? All right,
No objection, Judge.
each of those is admitted. In terms of publishing, I have a brief sidebar again with counsel, sorry. Now, if I don't want them displayed in public, but they'll be displayed for the jury as well as for the parties and counsels. So we have to rearrange briefly our courtroom and inconvenience those seated to my left who will need to be reseated. We'll go ahead and get those monitors set up here and allow their second brief break before the lunch hour. So we'll take care of that at this time. And I guess as quickly as we can get that rearranged, we'll come back on the record.
I'm sorry. Oh my gosh, thank you. I didn't even think about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Please be seated. All right, we are back on the record. The exhibits proposed 180A through L have been admitted. And Mr. Rickson, we discussed how these would be published also. Just to clarify, they won't be shown on the overhead projector nor broadcast in any way on the court's live stream. The jurors will be able to view those as well as the parties and you, Mr. Wixom, on this monitor here. So thank you for accommodating the request to organize the courtroom to accomplish that. If you'd like to continue with direct, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Before I begin my questioning again, I also have what's been marked as State's Proposed 423, which is a written FBI lab report generated by Mr. Halepaska that I tend to admit by stipulation to the court. I've got one for the defense and two for the court.
All right. And I believe, Mr. Pryor, you've seen this and there's no objection from the defense. Is that correct?
There is not, Judge. I don't need a copy, Judge. I've got a copy. Thank you. But there's no objection. It's by stipulation.
Okay, thank you. The court will take its courtesy copy. Thank you, Mr. Bailiff. Exhibit 423 is admitted.
Thank you.
May I, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you. Mr. Halepaska, before we get into the exhibits, I did want to go back and revisit some definitions for the jury that perhaps I failed to ask you about. When you do a pattern examination, can you explain the three different functions of that or what you might reach as an examiner in those instances?
Yes. The examination process can be broken into two separate levels. During the first level, it is focused on those class characteristics that I briefly discussed earlier. So at that point, I'm making observations on those tool marks under low magnification using a stereo microscope, which gives you kind of three-dimensional representation of the evidence itself. During that time, I'm documenting my findings into my notes, as well as taking some photographs as well. That's the first half, level one. The second half is focused on making the identification, the source identification, and that's focused on those microscopic imperfections, those individual characteristics. During this portion, I'm using a comparison microscope, and during that time, I'm actually able to look at two separate samples under the same viewing field. This is accomplished because the comparison microscope is actually two microscopes with an optical bridge. During that time, I'm looking at those individual characteristics on the samples and then generating a pattern match. And from there are three types of conclusions that I can render. An identification, a source identification. That's where I have consistent class characteristics. So the class characteristics must be shared amongst the different samples. And sufficient agreement in the individual characteristics. The next conclusion is not a no conclusion. So that's basically when I have consistent class characteristics, but insufficient individual characteristics. And then the third and final is the exclusion. That's where the two samples are excluded as being produced by the same tool. This is where I have dissimilar class characteristics.
Thank you, sir. So once again, has the witness had handed to him states 180A through L, Your Honor? May I ask?
I believe I have my courtesy copies. Yes, I do believe the witness has those.
Yes, I have.
Sir, just briefly, if you'll take a look at those and tell us what those exhibits consist of, not individually, but collectively.
They're images of two portions of a hip bone and an intact portion of a spine.
And are these images that you took as part of your analysis?
They are.
And they relate to Tylee Ryan?
Yes, sir, they do.
And just for your reference, we've also admitted your generated lab report. So as we go through questioning, if you feel like one of my questions could be best answered by your report, let me know. We'll ask permission from the court to publish that, to help you do that, okay?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Your Honor, with your permission, I would like to begin by publishing States 180A.
You may publish.
Thank you. May I just confirm if that's being seen on the screen by the jury as well as the witness? Thank you.
Do you mind rotating it
Which direction?
that way? Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sir, will you please explain what is in that photograph?
This is a portion of the hip bone, and what we're looking at is tool marks that have been generated onto that hip bone. But I also want to talk about some other terms I didn't mention earlier. They're action types. So the evidence we're looking at right now, there are two types of action types: stabbing and chopping. So a stabbing action, you can think of it as when a force is applied to a narrow portion of the working surface, like a knife tip, or it's being applied to an object. A chopping object is when force is applied over the long axis of that bladed working surface onto an object. And there's another action type not used here on this image, but it's called compressive force. And that's whenever force has been applied, but I wasn't actually able to obtain any kind of class characteristics. So those would be the terms I would be using throughout this testimony.
Thank you. And sir, if you will, with that explanation, could you, utilizing and pointing us to this particular exhibit, tell us what you found in this photo, what you documented?
Okay. So what I did to make things easier to see is I actually generated a digital box around each one of those tool marks, and I labeled them starting with A and worked my way from there. So what we can do is we can start with A right now, and that was caused from a stabbing action. And what I observed from it was that the force of the blow pierced the hard layer of the bone. Inside the bone, there's a hollow or softer tissue. The force from this blow was strong enough that it actually cracked part of the surface on the posterior of this bone. That was incurred from a stabbing action. B was incurred from a chopping action.
Sir, may I interrupt you? I'm sorry. But if we'll just do this one by one. On one, you indicated to the jury just now that was a stabbing action that you determined?
Yes, sir, it was.
Okay. And can we be clear, is that something that you can conclusively testify to, or is it simply consistent with a stabbing action?
Yes, it is consistent with a stabbing action.
And at this point in time, were you able to make a determination as to what kind of tool mark may have made that stabbing?
Judge,
alteration?
I'm going to object without some additional foundation.
Abstain.
In looking at that particular alteration, what analysis did you do, if any, to help identify if in fact you could tell what tool mark made that stabbing action?
During the examination process, I collected those class characteristics I referred to, so I was taking some measurements. When I moved on to the second portion of the analysis, looking for those individual characteristics, I wasn't able to identify any of those individual characteristics. I took it a step further in my analysis, and I used some casting material. Casting material is a silicone-based compound. Kind of looks like a small caulk gun, and what it does is you administer it over that tool mark. It dries, and you remove it, and from there, it will pick up the tool marks. In this case, I conducted 2 castings of that area and obtained no individual characteristics. From my analysis, I just concluded that it was consistent with a stabbing type action. But within my report, I talk about some tools that could have produced those stabbing type actions.
What tools do you believe would be consistent with those types of stabbing type actions?
Judge, I'm going to object. This calls for speculation. There hasn't been sufficient foundation for him to be able to make that determination.
I am going to sustain that at this point, Mr. Wixom.
Without getting into what your conclusion was, what did you do to look at and consider before you made your conclusion as to what kind of tool would have made that stabbing action?
Oftentimes, in order to make those determinations, we will make test marks. So an examiner will observe that tool mark. And from there, from my training and experience, which I didn't have an opportunity to talk about earlier, I had 2.5 years of training, I concluded that it was consistent with a stabbing type action. I had, in order to make those test marks, you want to use a comparable media. Fortunately, at the laboratory, we have some bones. I tried to replicate those tool marks. Wasn't able to replicate the same kind of tool marks. The bones that I was using were desiccated, they were dry. Where this bone here was still soft. It was still moist inside. So the way it interacted with the tool is different. But from my training experience, as well as taking some of those test marks, I concluded that this was consistent with a stabbing type action.
And did that analysis help you determine what you might believe, what kind of tool might be consistent with that stabbing action?
That's
Judge, again, okay. I'll withdraw this question, objection.
You
That's
can
another
answer.
question. He answered yes.
And what tools did you determine might be consistent with that mark?
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. Again, calls for speculation. It's clear that he can't make that determination.
I'll overrule the objection. I think it's subject to cross, obviously, but I think there's been sufficient foundation at this point based on the expertise he spoke to allow for the answer. So you can re-ask the question or he can answer if he remembers.
Thank you. Sir, do you remember the question?
yes.
You answer, please.
So the tools that were consistent with producing this type of mark was from a single bladed knife or a comparable tool. But however, other possibilities could not be ruled out as far as producing that stabbing type action.
And I assume that's because your finding was that it's consistent with, that's why other things couldn't be ruled out. Is that fair?
The fact that when I was making my test marks, I didn't have comparable media to replicate those same tool marks.
Okay, thank you.
That's correct.
Going back to the exhibit, I'll call your attention to, I believe that's marked as item B. Am I seeing that correctly, sir?
Yes, yes. Can we focus in a little more?
Sure.
Is that possible?
I will sure try.
That's good right there. Thank you.
Can you tell us what item B is showing us?
B is another tool mark. This one was consistent with a chopping tap action. This is where the force applied onto the bone occurred over a longer axis of the working surface of the tool itself.
Can you help the jury understand how do you identify that as a chopping action?
It's where the force is applied. So when I'm looking at that tool mark, I can see that the energy that was delivered to it was consistent. So when I was looking at this under a stereo microscope, I could see a lot more detail. And unlike the first one, where it's the stabbing type action, where that force was applied at a very narrow point, and you can see where other portions of the bone were kind of carried into that injury. Where for B, the chopping action, I can see where the force was consistent throughout the base of the injury. Actually, the force of the blow didn't actually cut through that first hard layer of bone.
And did you perform analysis on that mark to help you identify what you believe might have been the tool mark used to create that?
Yes, I did, to try to determine what kind of tool was used.
And briefly, what was the analysis that you did specific to that question?
The tools that I rendered were, it was a cleaver or a machete, a hatchet, or other similar bladed tools.
When you say rendered, what do you mean by that?
Oh, that was just the tool that was that's consistent with producing this type of damage.
So is that in fact what you determined from that mark? It was one of those types of tools that?
Yes, it was. And at this time, no tools were administered, or I'm sorry, submitted. At this time, I was only looking at the bones. So when I'm generating a report, I'm also casting kind of a wide net so that the investigators who are actually conducting their work basically have more information to work with as far as trying to recover different evidence items from the scene.
If in fact specific tools had been submitted to you for evaluation, how, if at all, could that have helped you in your analysis?
It would allow me to make test marks with the tools. But in order to make an identification, that second level of analysis, I have to have those individual characteristics. For both A and B, I was unable to obtain any individual characteristics from those tool marks. So in a situation like that, I wouldn't have been able to make a source conclusion on those tools.
So even had potential tools been submitted for your evaluation, you're saying you still couldn't have concluded with those particular marks what the tool was?
That's correct.
Thank you. Sir, I'd like to now call your attention to what you marked as item C on that exhibit and tell the jury what that is, please.
Yes. C and D, I have some other, I believe there's some other images closer in that I will be able to give a better explanation of them. But both of those were consistent with being produced from a chopping type action.
And we'll in fact get to those. So we'll just go forward on this. What about E and F?
I believe E was on the posterior of this bone, and it was created too from a chopping type action.
What do you mean by posterior of the bone?
The backside.
And that's reflected in this photo?
No, it is not.
But the front injury to the bone is reflected in the photo through E?
Yeah, it's that one's just A through D. E will be on the backside.
Sorry, I have poor vision, I suppose. Thank you. For the record, I am now putting up what's been marked as states 180B.
Could we rotate it? There you go. And just, oh no, you had it. There you go, right there, and just like that.
Let's start with the top photo and then I'll rotate it up. That's okay.
Okay. So this is from the image earlier. This is just a zoomed in of A. So basically what I did was I just wrote on the evidence. So I labeled A, and then I added my initials DJH. And what I was trying to capture here was, as I mentioned, this is from a stabbing type action. So you can see as that tool was being applied here and that force was being applied, you can see where some of the fracture lines and radial cracks, some of that energy from that bladed tool was being driven into the bone. And you can see the fracturing of that bone being carried into that hollow space within this hip bone.
And what about this portion of the exhibit?
It's the same image, just under magnification. And again, it just kind of speaks to the damage that occurred from that stabbing action.
And do you recall in your analysis, have there been some internal numbering given to Tylee's remains?
Could you rephrase the question?
Have there been any internal reference number that had been assigned to the FBI for the analysis for you and the other experts at the FBI?
Oh, yes. So as I mentioned earlier, when the evidence arrives at the laboratory, it goes to the evidence management unit. At that time, they'll render a unique identifier to the evidence. So in this case, FBI lab's concerned, this portion of the hip bone was labeled as item 16.
Thank you.
Is that your question?
Yes, thank you, sir. I'm now going to place on the screen States Exhibit 180C, as in Charlie,
You rotate, yep.
and tell us what that is.
So that one is B. Again, you can see my initials right there. I'm just demonstrating or trying to capture those fracture marks. So basically, the tool mark itself, you can briefly, or you can see kind of at the bottom, it's kind of darkened out, where essentially that energy was delivered into that bone and how it actually was consistent across that surface. So unlike the stabbing action, where that energy is being driven into a single point, this was over a broader surface.
So in fact, is this reflective of a stabbing or a chopping action?
Chopping action.
Thank you. And the image below there, what is that?
It's the same image, just zoomed in. What I'm trying to show right there is that you can see where the tool itself didn't pierce that first layer of bone. So basically, it left an impression at the base of that injury. And you can kind of see some of that broken material at the bottom, that whitish, brownish color. That's actually the bone kind of being pulverized inside that injury.
And in this particular injury, is this what you testified to a moment ago that you believe could be consistent with a cleaver, machete, hatchet, or other bladed instrument?
Yes, that is correct.
I am placing states 180D. Start with those two top photos.
What I'm demonstrating with the top left image, you can see those, how I labeled them. That's good right there. Thank you. I labeled it C and D. I've initialed it. The green arrow represents where that force was applied from. So as we're looking at this image right here, the force came from left to right into the injury. If you look at the image on the right, that's a close-up of tool mark D. And you can actually see a couple of things. One, the left side of that damaged area, you can actually see a long fractured area that it was actually carried into the injury itself. Like I said, the force came from left to right, but there was another observation that was made at this time. The red arrows are showing that there's these scallop-shaped portions of the tool mark. Those are consistent with being from a serrated tool, kind of like a saw, but in this case, this was not produced from a sawing action. It was produced from a bladed tool that had serrated teeth on it.
So just for the jury's clarity, I'm not sure, perhaps I'm colorblind, but which arrows were you just referencing? You said red arrows. Which arrows might those have been?
Okay, so the green arrow represents the force, where the direction of force came from. I'm on the right image, right there.
That arrow?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So that green arrow represents where the force came from, so it traveled from left to right. And then the black arrows are pointing out those scalloped impressions right there, or shapes. And those are consistent with being generated from a serrated tool.
So were you able to make a determination through your analysis what type of tool, or simply that it was a serrated tool or anything else?
Basically a cleaver, machete, or hatchet that had serrated teeth on it.
And this portion of that exhibit, what does it document?
For this one, the green arrow represents the force that's applied, so traveling from left to right. The black arrows, in this case, you can actually see those serrated teeth marks. They're a little more pronounced, and basically the black arrows are pointing them out, so you can actually see them on both the right and left side of that tool mark.
This is now states 180E. Can you please tell the jury what that's depicting?
Okay, so this is the backside of that hip bone. So what I labeled as A, as I mentioned earlier, that's A was caused from that stabbing action. When that stabbing action occurred, enough energy was transferred into it that it carried through that first hard layer of the bone into the soft material, and it actually caused a fracturing of the backside of that bone material. And you can actually see that right there with that dark impression where the part of that hip bone was cracking. D, that was the one that was caused from the chopping tap action, and it too carried through to the other side. So it cut through the first hard layer into that soft spongy material and then out toward the back, but it didn't quite travel all the way through. It just caused damage on the backside. And then for E down toward the bottom, that was the last tool mark that I found. The green arrow represents the force that was applied from left to right. And there's another image giving a close-up of it.
Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, sir, right there.
Anything you want to point out to the jury about
Yep.
that image?
So the green arrow, again, shows that the direction that the force was applied, left to right. And then the black arrows, I'm pointing out that those serrated tool marks that were generated. So you can actually kind of see how they were formed with some type of a chopping tap action that was applied from a tool that was consistent with a hatchet, cleaver, or machete with serrated type teeth on it.
Thank you. Your Honor, at this point, does the court wish me to continue or break for lunch? I've got about at least 15 minutes left, I think.
Okay. We did have a request to delay the lunch break slightly because of our food situation. So let's go ahead and continue on, Mr. Wixom. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, with respect to this portion of the bone, it looks like there's at least 3 points that you identified where the stabbing action penetrated through the bone, or almost at least in one instance.
There were 2 instances. That was for tool mark A and D, where the damage traveled through the bone.
Is that particular part of the bone relative to other bones? Is it a thicker part, a stronger part, a weaker part? Tell us more about that.
My experience with working with this was it was a pretty thick material, but I don't necessarily know if I have enough experience to really opine on that.
Is outside your scope?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm putting on the screen the state's 180F. Can you please tell the jury what that depicts?
This is an image of an intact spine. So the tool mark that I located on the spine was, you can see it in the box toward the base of the spine. I labeled it as A. So basically I just started the lettering over since this was a new evidence item, and the laboratory issued the unique identifier for this piece of evidence as item 17. And right there, it's difficult to see in the image, but that tool mark is actually at a much lower elevation. So the bone at the base of that green arrow is substantially higher in elevation. So the force that was applied onto this tool mark came, if the image was rotated standing up, it would come from left to right, but as this image is being shown here, from the base to the top. So that's how the force was applied. It was from a chopping tap action. And I believe I have another image as a close-up.
Would it be that image?
Yes, sir.
What does that image illustrate for the jury?
That's just a close-up of the same injury, and it was from a chopping tap action.
And on that particular injury, did you identify any tools that would be consistent with having made that chopping type action?
No, I did not. And actually, I like to clarify too that up until this point, all the tool marks that I mentioned for items 16A through E, I wasn't able to locate any individual characteristics within those injuries. The same for tool mark A here on item 17, the intact spine. No individual characteristics were located in my examination.
So if you will clarify, then you testified earlier on 180B that you found the tool mark to be consistent with having been made by a cleaver, machete, hatchet, or blade. What do you mean now? I'm not sure I follow what you just said.
Oh, it's just, as I mentioned earlier about my examination process, about source identification. So trying to source identify a tool back to a tool mark. In order to make that, I would have to have the microscopic characteristics. Those would be the individual characteristics. In the case of item 16 and in here for item 17, I wasn't able to find those individual characteristics. All I could do was just state that these tool marks were consistent with being produced by these types of tools.
And that distinction being chopping and stabbing tools.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm going to place states 180G. And if you could please explain to the jury the significance of that photo.
So a couple of things going on here. This is the item 19, and it's actually the other portion of the hip bone. If you look on the top left or the left side of the hip, you could actually see some black sooting. It appears that a portion of this was actually was in a fire and burnt. There were a number of different tool marks that were located on this item. I'm going to use some different terms. Let me, for tool mark, start with D right there. That one was from a chopping action. F, that was, as I mentioned earlier, that's another term called compressive force. So I wasn't actually able to identify any kind of class characteristics from it, nor individual, only that damage was occurred to the bone. And you actually see item F looks like it's kind of within an island. You can see there's a break around the entire thing. So there was enough force to actually break that bone, but not actually break it free from the hip. G was more compressive force. No individual or class characteristics were obtained from that mark. H was from a stabbing tap action. I have some other images of it. I'd like to talk about that one a bit later.
Sir, just for clarity, to go back, you were just mentioning F. Is that the area we were talking about?
Yes, sir, it is.
And that is that tool, well, that injury was a result of compressive force?
Yes, sir.
And can you explain that again? What does that mean?
Oh, so compressive force was applied with chopping and stabbing. It's just I use that term to mean that that same force was applied. I was just unable to obtain any class characteristics. So the tool itself, when it imparts those general measurable characteristics, in the case of F and G, no class characteristics were transferred.
And I don't know that I asked, but which item number internally to the FBI would this apply to?
That would be item 19.
Thank you. Excuse me, 180H. Could you please, first of all, which internal FBI number would this photo apply to?
This one still pertains to item 19.
Okay. And please explain in the top photo what we're seeing here.
Okay. Could you just lower it just a tad? Okay, that's perfect right there. Thank you. Okay, so for tool mark A, the green arrow represents the force that was applied. This occurred from a chopping tap action. It came down. It's difficult to see, but that chopping action stopped. The elevation at the base of that box is a lot higher. So the force that was applied to it wasn't able to cleave through that bone. I wasn't able to obtain any individual characteristics from it. For tool marks B and C, I labeled these as fractures. I wasn't able to obtain any kind of class characteristics nor individual characteristics, only that some force was applied and it actually fractured the bone. Perhaps even the same blow that was applied to the bone at B and C may have been from a single blow. And it actually cracked or shattered the bone at this point and caused the damage for both B and C.
And are these photos just more close-ups of the B and C we were just talking about?
Yes, you can see on the left side, my green Sharpie. So you can see that's where those fracture points occurred. And then the one on the right, it's just a close-up of one of those fracture points.
States 180I. Please tell us what that is. First of all, which FBI item number would that apply to?
This one's still 19, item 19. Could you zoom out a little? Okay. So it's good right there. So this is from tool mark D. This was from a chopping tap action. You can see the green arrow there. That's where the force came from. So the force came from, as the image shows it, from kind of the bottom left up. The force you can kind of see at the top left of the tool mark. You can see that the bone has actually shattered in separate places and fractured. Based on my training experience, it appears that the tool that was used actually cut through the bone and into that soft tissue and may have actually carried into it.
And with that, were you able to identify any particular tool that would have been consistent with that tool mark?
I wasn't able to obtain the individual characteristics, so all I can say was it's consistent with being from a cleaver, a machete, or a hatchet or some type of similar bladed tool.
And what does this photo do to help the jury?
That's just another image. You can kind of see D right there, and you can see the green arrow. It's showing the force of that blow. There's another tool mark under it. Can we zoom in a little bit? Would it be possible if I could review my notes real quick? Yes,
The notes as contained in your lab report?
yes,
the-
sir.
The admitted exhibit? Can you indicate to me what portion of the exhibit, and I'll publish that and let you review?
I was just
Judge.
trying to find the comparable image to this.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. Is he trying to refresh his recollection, or I'm not sure what the
Yes.
process is here?
Okay, Mr. Halepaska, please let me respond to the objections. We need to clarify that, Mr. Wixom, as to whether or not it's a reference to admitted 423 or whether or not it's a review of notes for refreshing recollection.
Certainly, Your Honor. As I've asked this question, I think he's indicated he does need to refresh, but it would be from an admitted exhibit 423. So I believe that because it's been admitted, he would have the ability to do that with the court's permission.
Yes, he can review the exhibit and either testify from it or about it since it's been admitted.
Thank you. So, sir, you have permission now. Take a moment and identify what you need to refresh, and then you can answer the question.
I see there was another image that clarifies it for me. So can we zoom? Is there a zoom feature? Not a zoom feature, a focus feature?
There probably is. That doesn't mean I'm smart enough to know how to do it here. Sorry.
You want to assist, Mr. Wood?
That's good right there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So the green arrow toward the top, that's the force that's being applied to tool mark D. Underneath it, that's tool mark E. And the green arrow is again showing where that force from that chopping type action is occurring from. And then below that, you can see tool mark F. That's the one I mentioned earlier that was from compressive force. And this is a good illustration. You could see basically it looks like a square. That's basically where the bone has shattered. Again, I wasn't able to obtain any class characteristics from that tool mark. But for D and E, those were both consistent with a chopping tap action. And I was not able to obtain any individual characteristics from those tool marks.
I'm putting up states 180J, and if we could start by you identifying which internal FBI number would apply to that.
Okay. Can we zoom on the left image?
Is that what you're asking? That work?
Yes, yes. We could zoom in a little more. That's good right there. And maybe focus a little. Oh, that's perfect right there. This is still item 19, and these are tool marks H and G. G was generated using compressive force. I wasn't able to obtain any class characteristics or individual characteristics from toolmark G, other than the fact that some force was applied on it and it caused an impression on the bone. Toolmark H, that was created by a stabbing type action. It's a very small injury. As you can see right there, I took a measurement of it and it's approximately 0.058 of an inch, so very small. But this injury actually caused a channel to form underneath the bone, that top hard layer of the bone. And if you look at the image on the right, that's just a close-up of toolmark G, and you can see where the shadow's being casted. So you can see the kind of damage that occurred to that part of the bone.
Mr. Halepaska, on back to image H, you said it caused a channel to form.
Yeah, small channel under the bone.
What does that do to your analysis? Why is that significant?
For me, it was a different type of tool, consistent with one of that being of a pick, like an ice pick, but with a very narrow working surface.
Any other observations from that?
No, then no more.
Thank you. 180K.
If it's possible, can we just draw out? I created this this image because I just wanted to reflect the totality of the tool marks. So item 19, item 16, and item 17, they're all there together. I've actually labeled each one of the tool marks that I've already reviewed with you.
Anything else about that exhibit?
No, everything's been covered.
And then 180L.
This is the backside of those same items, item 16, 19, and 17. Again, the tools or the tool marks that I couldn't obtain any kind of class characteristics from, that would be F. You can see that on the top right there for item 19, and then C, D, or B and C, that's from that fracturing. And then also A, that's just damage from that stabbing type action that I talked with about the first tool mark that we reviewed during my testimony. You can kind of see that damage as it's coming through the bone.
You have a note on this. First of all, did you create that notation in the upper left, damage first occurred?
Yes, I did.
What are you telling us there? Why is that significant?
So, and I failed to mention D there. So if you see A in the middle of item 16, if you look to the left, you can see D, and it has that asterisk there. I was just trying to show that damaged area is related to damage that occurred on the front side of the hip bone. But at the same time, enough force was applied that damage could be observed on the back side of that bone.
So is it fair to say from this exhibit, this is the back side of the hip bones? Is that correct?
Yes, the back side of the hip bone and the spine.
Okay. So did the majority of the tool marks occur from the back side of the hip bone or from the front side?
Most occur from the front.
Just one moment, Your Honor. So just because we've gone through a lot of photos and tool marks, I just want to recap. With respect to any of these tool marks, and I'm done publishing, Your Honor.
Okay.
With respect to any of these tool marks, it sounds like some of the items as testified to, you believe came from a chopping force. Is that right?
That's correct. Only two of the tool marks that I mentioned came from a stabbing type action. The majority of them came from chopping type action.
And the chopping, you're saying are consistent with the cleaver, machete, those types of
Yeah.
tools.
And similar bladed tools. That is correct.
And with respect to the stabbing, if I'm correct, you did not identify any particular tools that those would be consistent with.
Other than a single bladed tool or similar type for 16A. And then for the other tool mark, I believe it was on item 19. And that was from a type of a tool similar to like a pick.
And just a last question, again, assuming you had been provided reference tools to assess, what types of things would you still not have been able to determine even if you had those tools provided to you?
If I had the tools, I would have been able to make test marks, which would have been helpful in narrowing down the tools. However, since I was unable to collect any individual characteristics from either of the bones, I wouldn't have been able to conduct the second level of examination, which is on the microscopic marks, which allow me to identify a tool mark back to a particular tool that I would not have been able to do.
Just one more second, please, Judge.
Yes.
Your Honor, we don't have any further questions at this time.
All right. Council, let me have a brief sidebar just regarding scheduling here momentarily. All right, thanks, council. That will conclude the direct. There was some delay that occurred today with our lunch, so at this time, discussing with council, I think it just makes sense. We'll go ahead and allow for cross at this time. And then once we conclude with this witness, we will have our lunch recess. So go ahead, Mr. Pryor.
Let's try this again, sir. You wrote in your report that you're really unable to make a source conclusion on a lot of these items. Would that be fair?
That's correct. I wasn't able to make any source determinations.
And let's clarify what you mean by source determination.
A source determination is when using the tool marks that I'm able to identify the tool marks back to a particular tool.
And how does individual characteristics play into that?
That they're critical. Without the individual characteristics, it's not possible to render a source determination.
And in this case, there were no individual characteristics as well. Would that be fair?
No, that is correct. There were no individual characteristics.
And then class characteristics, define that again for me.
Class characteristics are those general or measurable features of a specimen. Class characteristics are determined prior to manufacture. They're design factors. And these are the characteristics that are used to generate different populations. So they're the first half of the examination process.
Different varieties of potential tools. Would that be a simpler way to put that?
They allow me to actually put the different tool marks into the different populations.
Okay.
That is correct.
And you put in your report that tool mark identification is an empirical science, and it relies on objective measurements and a subjective comparison. Would you agree with that still?
That is correct. So the objective part of the examination is those class characteristics. Those are documenting the general and the measurable features during the class characteristics. So that's the objective. The subjective part is doing the microscopic examination, and that's while using those individual characteristics. And again, I was never actually able to get to that part of the examination process.
So when you say you weren't able to get to an individual characteristics, part of your analysis basically stopped at the objective, and you really couldn't make any distinctive determination of exactly what caused any of these marks. Wouldn't that be fair?
I wasn't able to identify it back to a particular tool. That is correct.
Okay, Judge, I have nothing else. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Pryor. Any
I have
redirect?
One question, Your Honor, if I may.
Go ahead. Once you're ready.
So, sir, in your analysis, is there any question that some kind of tool was used to injure Tylee and her bones?
Absolutely. Yeah, a tool was used to cause that those tool marks. That is true. I just wasn't able to render any kind of source identification on those tool marks. That is correct.
No more questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. That'll conclude the testimony then of Mr. Halepaska. We'll go ahead and take our lunch recess. Can he be excused and released from any subpoena?
Actually, Your Honor, we would like to him kept under subpoena. He may be a rebuttal witness.
Okay, so with that in mind, then there is a court exclusionary order. The prosecution can further explain that. You may be required to ask or answer some questions on viewing testimony that may not apply depending on the context of your testimony and whether it falls as an expert witness or not. So I'll leave that up to the state to advise him. With that in mind, then, thank you for appearing and testifying this morning. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take the lunch recess. We had that additional break this morning, so if we can, hopefully we can do lunch in under an hour today, perhaps. Let's try to get back at about 1:15 or 1:20, if that works for council.